Okay, welcome everyone to this next session. We consider this to be the most important session in the entire World Bank Spring meetings. So you all are that vanguard of thought leaders who are in on what's going to be the biggest issue at the next set of World Bank meetings, and that's community-led development. We in the Hunger Project and in many civil society organizations believe is just absolutely essential and yet almost entirely ignored. So that's why your presence here is so important, and we're also recording today so that we can share it on YouTube with the several billion people who aren't with us today, but we'll be taking up this issue in the future. Now, in his December synthesis report on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Secretary General grouped all of the goals and all of the indicators and targets within 6 major themes of people, dignity, prosperity, justice, partnership, and the planet. All of these issues must be addressed together in an integrated strategy, or we'll never solve any of them. They're also mutually independent. That was also true of the MDGs, but that emphasis on integration, on the synergies among the different issues wasn't at all emphasized during the MDGs, and it's essential to integrate them for the next 15 years if we're going to hit those goals. And the person where this must happen, the people who are really on the front lines of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, are represented here by her. A 15-year-old young mother in Mozambique trying to scratch out a living on marginal land, no access to health, no access to education. Wherever she goes on foot with her baby on her back. And so her universe is literally 10 to 15 kilometers radius. That's as far as she can safely go in a day. Now, she has a fundamental human right to participate in governance. So if there is no governance within 10 or 15 kilometers of her, there is no governance. So all of those Sustainable Development Goals, all of the resources, all of the synergies, all the place where it has to come together is in her community. And that's what we need to think about as we develop strategies, programs, plans, and as the World Bank and the bilaterals and the UN agencies, that all of these have to come together in a harmonious, integrated strategy that is led by the communities themselves. So we in the Hunger Project have a strategy. In Africa, it's called the Epicenter Strategy. But what I've learned is that many of our colleagues across all of the civil society organizations really share a lot of these same elements of these strategies of starting with women's empowerment, with breaking the mindset of patriarchy that has put in place those top-down siloed programs to begin with, mobilizing people for self-reliant action, strengthening participatory local democracy at the community level so that people's fundamental human right can be fulfilled, building people's capacity and leadership, taking a multi-sectoral approach so that health, education, water, sanitation are all happening simultaneously, and committing oneself to the long term. You cannot do the Sustainable Development Goals and expect 1-year impact evaluations. That is just a stupid way to do programming. So we're hoping to get that transformed as well. So our first speaker today is from an organization that I have great admiration for because it works from Catholic social teaching, including the principle of subsidiarity. Be sure to Wikipedia subsidiarity. Pope Pius XI made it into social teaching. But that principle, that decision-making has got to be close to the people as a fundamental principle of human dignity is something that all of us are working for. So our first speaker, though, is Mirza Jahani. Mirza is CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation here in Washington, D.C., another organization that I've admired for more than 30 years, and have learned a lot from, particularly in northern Pakistan. The way that grassroots activists reach out in male-female couples in this very patriarchal society is quite miraculous. So let me turn it over first to Mirza.
Thank you very much, John, for those kind words and for the introduction, which I fully concur with, and you've taken a bit of a thunder away from me. I will go into some of the specificities, but if I do that, before I do that, just one quick word about the Aga Khan Foundation, the Aga Khan Development Network, whose founder is His Highness the Aga Khan, the 49th Imam of the Shia Imami Muslims. And it's interesting that you remind us of the Catholic teachings, because Islamic teachings are also equally rooted in the dignity of man and women, in their own, defining their own destinies. And so very often we, in world faiths, look at the differences between faiths, but we forget that actually, certainly amongst the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, there is essentially the notion that we are people of the book, al-Kitab, as we say. So thank you for reminding us of that, John. For us, community-led development started right from the outset of our work way back in the 1960s and 1970s, creeping into the 1980s when people like Robert Chambers were pioneering participatory rural appraisal techniques, which some of you might have heard of. If you haven't heard of it, please look it up, because that was the real launching pad for listening to people about what their development desires were, and then trying to build around that felt need of individuals. And we've done that in many parts of the world, going down to grassroots and creating what we call village organizations or inclusive self-help groups, the sort of things that is embedded in integrated development approaches. You will all have done that. And we continue to do a lot of that, and we continue to argue with the likes of USAID or the World Bank that this is a good way forward. But one of the major shifts that have occurred in the last 10 years, 15 years, is perhaps surprisingly, but nonetheless understandably, governments are recipient, host governments, country governments, whatever we call them, are beginning to recognize that, hey, gee, listening to people and responding to them is not a bad idea. And certainly in countries like India, Pakistan, South Africa, we are seeing a lot more of that. Currently, where there's a fragile state, that obviously is a lot more difficult to do. And I think that that's an opportunity that the likes of the World Bank, as they do the SDGs, have to recognize that it's not us just shouting about community-led development. It really is about governments accepting that and beginning to implement that. Now, having said that, the new challenge for us is actually the organizations and citizen voices that are out there are actually not that sustainable. We can do lots of women's associations and water users organizations, health committees, the likes that you've all done. Well, how many of them are actually sustainable? we are still very much involved in project-based development. And for me, it's a joy to work for someone like the Aga Khan Development Network, because they have a very long-term perspective, something that John mentioned in his introductory remarks. And one would like to think that if there was an enlightened government, if there was a stronger government, a more caring government, a more democratic government, and would it actually have a long-term sense of development? Would it actually plan and develop in a long-term way? We know quite clearly, even in the West, politicians have very short time frames. So why would we expect in Africa and Asia the time frames would be longer? And for that reason, I think that in community-based development, we have to embrace the government as much as we can, but continue to ask the question, how do we create sustainable civil society organizations? What does that mean? And if we have time, I can give you one example of what we are doing with Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Mott Foundation around a global alliance for community philanthropy. Remind me to talk about that and ask me the question if you want to hear more about it, because John will signal my time is coming up. But then there's another constituency that we've tended to not embrace as much as we should, certainly in the civil society community-led development effort, which is the private sector. And now increasingly, through the origins of corporate social responsibility and recognizing that the markets are important, etc., some extractive industries like Shell and Texaco oil have started to do community-based development in the Niger River Delta, for example. They've got a good program going on out there. But what I want us to think about is not just corporate social responsibility, but how does the private sector get embraced and integrated into the development approach. And in that area, we are working a lot more on impact investment. For those of you for whom this word or phrase is new, it's essentially saying that there are increasingly a whole range of private sector investors who want to provide funding, yes, to make a bit of money, but that's not the driver for their investment. They want both social returns and financial returns. And there's a whole body of work that's out there looking at how do you measure social returns in an impact investment and what does that mean. And I think that those group of private sector investors that are emerging will be the ones that will appreciate much more, A, the long-term time frame. You can't put up a power station and make it a 3-year project. Hydropower generation is only profitable if you do an analysis over 25 years, because money starts to get better and revenues increase after your capital expenditure has been spent. So more than the governments, more than politicians, I'm finding the private sector is very quick at understanding, yeah, gee, we understand you have to make an investment for 20 years before returns emerge. So if you tell me that you need to develop the community first and do community organization, and then agriculture production will go up, and then they'll supply more crops to my factory to can and send to Europe, as we do in some investors in Kenya, they get it. And if people don't have enough water to grow their crops, gee, that will have a problem for me as well, because I won't get the beans to can to send to France. So, I think that's a sort of, that's an integrated approach that I'm looking for, not to just go to private sector and say, give us your money because you should be doing more corporate social responsibility, but rather, give us your money to do good work so that your own investments return more money. And there's a win-win to look at. Similarly, the example is even more acute in the environment and climate area. If less rain falls, if drought extends beyond certain periods, if agriculture is less predictable, well, gee, you won't have the crops to actually process to send to Europe. Your pineapples won't grow in time. The juice won't be as tasty as it should be. You know, all those sorts of things can be brought to the table so that we have a common purpose for actually protecting the planet, as opposed to just shouting at their doors and saying, excuse me, you know, you are making too much profit. Which is not, you know, a wrong thing, and I'm not disparaging anybody who wants to do that. But I think that there are alternative ways to do it, and they are rooted fundamentally in community-led development. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Mirza.